Welcome to the Execution is King podcast, where we talk to successful startup founders, investors, and ecosystem builders to cover insights and best practices for the next generation of great global startups. Today, we're going to be talking with Joe Sriver, CEO of Forgiving. So, Rob, Facebook recently rebranded as Meta, and everybody is talking about the metaverse, and not a lot of people quite know what it is yet, but we kind of sense that something big's happening. Like there's this big paradigm shift. What was your experience like in previous big shifts like this?
So paradigm shifts are really interesting. And with Joe on our podcast today, we both went through a couple of these, and one of those was kind of the initial advent of the internet in the 90s and early 2000s. Him at Google, and then his own startup DoApp for the iPhone. For me, it was kind of publishing my own websites, and then kind of within the business that we had created, launching a business for iPhone and Android in the early, 2009, 2010. But, it's interesting when you're designing a startup or you're thinking about a startup's kind of strategy and roadmap, when you have these paradigm shifts with new platforms, you have to think about what's the killer app going to be for startups that are going to compete with me in my vertical. And there's all these kind of first mover advantages in terms of network effects or switching costs. So you really want to think that through early, because that first mover advantage can be hard to unseat. And and I think about that, it's actually been 13 years since the iPhone shipped. I think it was 2008. And here we are in 2021. And it still feels very much like for mobile compute, we're still like in the second or third inning. There's still people dreaming up, new mobile app kind of first use cases that are completely dominating verticals. And I think we're still like in the early innings of the mobile compute, but now we're probably, 2, 3, 4 years out from the, this new metaverse world. And, imagine what the world's going to look like when we have 1 billion users walking around with smart glasses over their eyes and leveraging, particularly, I think, the augmented reality use cases. So I think it's just really interesting to think about. And I think, the real pioneers that jump on these paradigm shifts early, there's many examples of them who sort of rode those waves to just multi-billion-dollar kind of outcomes. Joe talks about what it was like going from designing web experience at Google and the interface is to, simplifying things for a small mobile screen, and the importance of simplicity and data and really both those examples, but especially in a small screen factor. Imagine that for what's needed for a full 3-dimensional context-aware glasses experience. I have no doubt that there's going to be like a whole different breed of applications that are like things we've never even seen before. Joe, for starters, can you tell us a little bit about your background kind of through your career and just introduce yourself for our listeners today?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity. I appreciate it, Rob. So I began my career after college at IBM. Before college, I was fortunate to work as an intern at Intel Corporation. That kind of gave me a path for my future career. So I was at IBM for about 3.5 years in Rochester, Minnesota, just down south from the Twin Cities. Then I was fortunate to move on to Google as their first UI UX employee. And I was hired in 2000, started in 2001. I was there for about 5 years. Then I moved back to the cities and started a company with a couple of guys that I knew from my days back at IBM. It's called DoApp, and we were fortunate to be at the forefront of when the mobile technology started taking off with the iPhone and Android devices. We had kind of 3 companies within DoApp, and we were fortunate to have 3 exits through DoApp. After DoApp, then I met a guy down in Rochester that was working on a fundraising software platform. And actually, during DoApp, I had some ideas around the fundraising space. So this guy had some stuff going on already. I joined him, and that company is called Forgiving. I'm at Forgiving right now, and we're having a great time.
You were the first UI UX hire at Google. I mean, I envision you walking into the garage, but I suppose there's a few more employees than that at that point.
I always think of that. So the group I was at IBM, obviously IBM is a huge company and still is. The group I was at IBM had about 200 people. And at the time when I joined Google, they were just under 200 people. So I thought, oh, it's just, kind of a lateral move, to another group of 200 people. But by the time I left Google, it was, I think it was probably about 10,000 people. And I have no idea what they're at now. But at the time, I didn't think it was the early days. But now looking back, it was the early days of Google. And so it was exciting just to be part of that.
I know we've known each other for a few years, Joe, and as an entrepreneur who's been building software companies since I was 15, 25 years or whatever, I think maybe a lot of entrepreneurs would feel like myself, where it's just like you dream of creating a company, to the scale of a Google or an Amazon or an Uber. And because quite frankly, I think it's really interesting because so few people will ever get a chance in their lifetime to have that kind of an experience. I mean, there's just not that many companies that are the most valuable in the world that are getting started. So would love to learn more about, some of the takeaways.
One of the big takeaways from my experience at Google was just their focus on collecting data and making decisions from the data that they're collecting. And that was one thing that, I'll be honest, I didn't really think about too much before I got to Google, like from my Intel or IBM days, but they were big into that. And that kind of set my course for future endeavors at DoApp as well as Forgiving, having data drive the decisions that we make. One of the projects at Google that I was involved in was just the look and feel of how ads appear on the search results page. And now they've kind of gone away from the ad look and feel, still somewhat similar these days, but they used to have ads on the side of the page. Those were what I was responsible for, kind of designing the look and feel. And it was just always interesting to see small changes like bolding text or putting a line here, or horizontal rule there, or just the color of the background or the size of the font, just how much of a massive change that would create as far as revenue coming in. They would do these experiments, they called them 5% experiments, where they just took about 5% of their traffic and they would put them through this kind of experimental UI route when they're searching pages. At the time, 5% was still a large number of folks that were going through the pages. It's just interesting to see how just these A/B tests that we did back in the day, how much of a change, just like I said, little things, bolding text, putting a horizontal rule here or there would change the click-through rate. I forget the exact numbers, but I mean, it was like millions of dollars, more of revenue on a daily basis that they'd be getting just with these little changes. So, and that kind of, like I said, set the course to look at data and at DoApp as well as Forgiving. And we may not have the amount of users and people. I think those experiments and A/B testing is still really important.
So you end up going from Google, and wouldn't have known at the time, of course, but went on to become one of the most valuable companies in the world. And then you leave and you go found your own startup in DoApp. What was going through your mind at that time when you decided to leave Google, and what was sort of the original idea and plan for DoApp?
Sure. So after Google, I was kind of in the heart of technology in Silicon Valley. So I came back to Minnesota. I thought maybe I was kind of on my own as far as tech startups and startups in general, but I still kind of like that startup feel and entrepreneurship. So in about, I think, end of 2006 or so, I started a company at the time. It was called PagePow, and it was a focus on just widgets. Like back then with blogs and stuff, there's like little widgets that you put on like your blog to tell weather or stock quotes. Well, I was actually working with a group of developers in Hopkins, Minnesota. Got to the point where I thought maybe I should bring this in-house. So I tapped my buddies that I met down in Rochester back in my IBM days, Wade Beavers and Dave Barillo, and said, hey, we talked about a bunch of different ideas when back in the late 90s, and are you at a point in your career to jump ship and join me on this startup ride? And fortunately, they were excited. So Wade and Dave came on board, and Wade and Dave had some experience on mobile stuff that they were doing for IBM, I think on BlackBerry or the mobile technology of the day then in the late 2000s. And they said, well, we've been experimenting with mobile at IBM, and I think that's the future. And fortunately, around that time, I think it was in July of 07 or end of 07 where the iPhone came out or debuted. And then in 08, spring of 08 is when the App Store debuted, or maybe it was July of 08. I'd have to look back. anyway, so we were fortunate at DoApp. We kind of jump ship from the widgets. I forget the numbers, but I think the initial developer pool for the App Store was maybe 500 people or 500 developers, and we thought, being in Minnesota, we never have a chance. But fortunately, Apple picked us, and we had actually, I think, three of the first either 500 or three of the first 1,000 apps. So that we were very fortunate. And actually, one of the apps that we had was a flashlight app that, because with my old flip phone, and I used to like search around, had my phone on to search around for stuff in the dark. And I thought, well, could just have a white screen on the iPhone and make it into a flashlight. And so actually that app during the course of DoApp was actually probably one of our most popular apps. Even after they had that flashlight on the back with the flash on the camera, people were still downloading the MyLight app, as we called it. Actually, at the beginning, we had a slew of apps in a bunch of different verticals. We had some game apps, we had some utility apps like the MyLight, some other random apps. And so Wade had the foresight to kind of start focusing. We had a contact at WCCO in town here, and we're able to do a news app for them. So that got us kind of to the news and media app. Dave had some experience in real estate, so we started down a real estate vertical. Being that basically half our team was in Rochester, Minnesota, they had some contacts at Mayo. So then we had a medical kind of vertical. So we were essentially planted in three different verticals: medical, real estate, and media. And eventually we found a way to exit all those verticals. So the first was the medical vertical. That was a deal that we had with the Mayo Clinic. We were kind of 50-50 in that, and we sold it to Axial Exchange, I think, was the company that we sold it to. We sold the medical in 2012. And then in 2014, we sold the real estate apps that we developed to a company called CoreLogic. And then in 2016, we sold the news app that was sold to a local company in Minneapolis called News Cycle. And now it's called Naviga. The news apps, and I think the real estate apps still exist in some form.
Did I hear in there that you invented the cell phone flashlight?
It was called the MyLight. I think it was basically the first kind of flashlight, which was this. I mean, it was a flashlight, just the screen was white and could find things in the night. Yeah, I think that was the first flashlight in the App Store. I'd have to look. I haven't searched the App Store recently, but I think it might still be in there.
Wow, talk about identifying a real need right there, right?
Yeah. I just love this story, Joe. I've had the good fortune of kind of living through a couple of major compute paradigms, like the birth of the internet in the mid 90s, and as a teenager, publishing websites, right after like Netscape browser comes out, and the just excitement. You're just sort of, when you're that early into and I know that's around the time on the App Store when you and I met, I believe, and
yep.
We just sort of like when you see these new kind of particularly like consumer platforms emerge. There's just like so much buzz and excitement to be there early. And part of it is it's the not knowing, right? It's not always like this super linear path of like, what are we going to use the iPhone for? From a flashlight to a health app to real estate listings or real estate apps to, what ultimately I think was the news app business, kind of the most successful of all that. And then,
yeah.
But like I see that now, I think a lot of entrepreneurs are sometimes maybe late adopters and they kind of let the dust settle, but some of the real pioneering work that comes on these compute platforms. And of course, now I see that there's always, it seems like now we're talking about metaverse and we're talking about the, things that are happening in VR and AR and Oculus. And it seems like obviously the large investments into the hardware with like smart glasses and like, it seems like the new form factor that may eventually make its way would be the smart glasses, but it creates almost like a completely different product design. You almost have to invent it as you go, right? Because no one really knew how to design a smartphone app, at the time you guys were working, right? How did you figure out even like what to build or what kind of UI and UX patterns to kind of use?
We had a strategy session early on, and we had like a list of hundreds of app ideas. But then actually at the time, before the App Store came out, you could jailbreak your phone and there's like some like faux kind of app stores on the internet. And we were searching those, and we thought, all these ideas, hundreds of ideas that we had, were unique to themselves. But we looked at these jailbreak app stores or whatever they were called. and we saw, oh, wait, everybody has the same kind of list of ideas that we have. And the UI stuff, I mean, I personally think of myself as a UI designer still, but the whole kind of space has completely expanded with even within the space. Like, I mean, just different designs you have to create for all the different browsers, plus the mobile browsers, different mobile phones, and it's just a kind of a headache when you start thinking about it.
You've had this experience working a part of a number of teams at Google, and then some of your own entrepreneurial endeavors. And you kind of talk about this importance of, in the way you were building your teams as you were telling the story about actually having, practical experience working with a lot of the people. Can you talk a little bit about that and, what's gone into building your teams and some of the lessons that you've learned?
I think the strategy that Wade had that I've tried to follow with Forgiving is just and it's just kind of finding these people that you work well with. And one thing I didn't realize is in Silicon Valley is that, like, kind of there's these groups of engineers that, however they met, maybe they met at school or maybe they met at a different job, but they kind of go around in groups, like, to different people. So I noticed that after Google, like, kind of these groups of people, like in those project managers as well as engineers, they kind of went as a group down to, like, Facebook, then to wherever else. And I thought that was kind of an interesting concept, that once you find a group of people that you work well with and you kind of their ins and outs, and it's interesting to kind of follow them to different startups. And so I think that's kind of what I tried to do. I mean, I knew Pete and Jim well, and so I asked them if they would mind coming to Forgiving, and they did. So I worked well with them at DoApp. I've been fortunate to find the kind of my group of people. And
that reminds me of Silicon Valley. There's an episode where they're at Hooli, and I forget who the CEO of Hooli is, but he's like looking out this window and commenting to his assistant that, like, the developers always travel in packs. And
right.
He's like judging them by, he's judging them by appearance. It's really interesting, that idea.
I remember, that episode, with Gavin Belson. But yeah.
I think you see these patterns. Yeah. It's interesting to hear your story. And, I see these patterns of, as an investor, and then in my own operating experience or entrepreneurial experience, I see these patterns, and this pattern of sort of, the world's in really short supply of people that know how to build digital products and do it at the highest levels. Whether I'm in building a product for my own business or I'm an investor, I always kind of observe, take notice of who I think are really the top performers that are working really well. And I just sort of take note of that for the rest of my life. There are people who worked for me 10 or 15 years ago, maybe even for less than a year, who I always make it a point to check in with them like a couple times a year, because I always want to work with them again. The kind of people who can blow you away with their execution. It could be on, like software development, it could be designers, could be even sales or marketing talent. When you have a chance to work with someone like that, you kind of want to spend the rest of your time figuring out how do you get them back into your orbit so you can work with them again. So I think this kind of clustering makes a lot of sense, because there's just so few people that have those kind of execution abilities. And then I think once you find them and you work well, maybe you have a similar like cultural values, it kind of seems natural that you'd see this clustering. And I guess that's probably an importance in hiring. Like if you don't have that kind of a network, then maybe your first few hires are going to be so important because they're going to lead to the next hires. And so if you find people that have been in really high performing teams, they're going to probably want to bring their friends to come work on interesting projects, right? So, in the early stage startup, that's probably, if you're doing it for the first time and you don't have that kind of a network, maybe you can try to, it's so important to get those first hires right? Because it can kind of lead to almost like a domino effect, right?
Right. Yeah. So at Forgiving, we're a pretty small team. There's actually just 4 people that are full time, but yeah, at some point we'll probably have to hire another developer. And already Pete, has a list of people that he knows, that he trusts, and knows, a similar work ethic and coding ethic that he does. And so you're absolutely right that you kind of rely on the kind of, you have the core network, but then, people know people, and you kind of expand out from there. So.
Yeah, that's super relevant now. The first thing I saw on LinkedIn today was an article about procuring tech talent. and competing for it effectively, because I mean the job market right now is incredibly competitive. But after all the recruiting and all the LinkedIn posting and everything falls away, that's kind of what it comes down to, is these
Right.
relationships.
Joe, can you kind of describe Forgiving? What was the original idea behind it? And also talk to us a little bit about how this is going to benefit the philanthropy world going forward.
Sure. So the ideas that I had regarding fundraiser when I was back at DoApp, and we were already in 3 different verticals, so fundraising didn't turn out to be one of them. But I've been fortunate to be able to go to different galas and events and fundraising events, and kind of looked at the software that they'd have, and like, this is it's going to be a lot simpler. And that, so when I joined Forgiving, it was approximately about 6 months or a year old when I joined. I think Forgiving started in late 2017. And I joined in about mid to late 2018. And at the time, it was just the founder, and he had outsourced the development work to a team that he knew. So then that's when I brought in Pete, the developer, that I said, we need to bring the development in house. We can't have a outside vendor doing it. So we brought it in house. I hired Pete, who was a developer I met at DoApp, that's still with us, and we started creating stuff alone. Actually, at the time, I was kind of I arrogantly thought that I could take on the UI stuff as well, and I did for the first few months. But I thought, this is getting too much, and with other CEO type stuff that I had to do. So then that's when I reached out to Jim. So he came on board and has done a great job to take over the UI stuff.
So with Forgiving, how many nonprofits are currently using the platform? And the main functionality, is it kind of centered around payments and kind of marketing to donors, or what's some of the core functionality you all have designed?
Currently with Forgiving, we have approximately about 350 to 400 nonprofits and organizations using the system. And the kind of goal behind Forgiving was just to make it really simple for a nonprofit to get up and running on their fundraiser. I mean, the nonprofits that we talk to are generally small. They have maybe 2 to 5 people on their staff, and most of them are probably part-time, or they're just volunteer, and they're not even part-time, they're volunteers. They don't have time to figure out, a new fundraising software. So that was kind of the point behind Forgiving, is just make it ultra simple for a person to just go in there, quickly get a fundraiser up and running. You will share it on social media, by email or whatever.
I see a cultural issue kind of in the middle of the country after spending time in San Francisco with my last company. The lack of perceived value of equity. For one, we hired a lot of people here and a few in the Bay Area as we built up our office. And I always tell this story that, we had, let's say I hired 350 people in Minnesota. And I think I can only think of a couple of times where any employees we hired really negotiated their equity packages. And then conversely, this is a sign of the culture. Like in San Francisco, I think every single employee we would hire negotiated their equity, even like our administrative staff, like a receptionist or whatever. And I thought, this is so different. Like, it shows you the negotiation of your equity package. It sort of shows you the value that is perceived to have.
Right. Well, yeah, that's one thing after I left Google that I didn't know going in there, is that, I could have said, hey, I'll take, X dollars less for my yearly salary for, more equity. And I obviously, looking back, I probably should have done that. I didn't even know that you could do that. The other thing is that I didn't really have much money just Silicon Valley is an expensive place to live, and I'd rather probably have a place to live than, equity that may not mean anything. I know I have several friends that worked at, I forgot what companies this one particular guy worked at, but like 3 different startups where the equity eventually went to zero because the company fell or whatever, and Google was the winner. But I was certainly fortunate to be on that ride for as long as I have been. I guess I'm technically still on that ride.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That's often advice I often find sharing with my friends that are joining early stage companies is, can you go without a vacation for the next year or two? And like, maybe you can get, 50% more equity if you just accept 20% lower base, or if you did that throughout your whole career, like usually the compounding nature of the equity returns is going to be like life-changing for you, those little decisions. Like, I know everyone has different personal financial situations or goals, and most people I don't think are really building startups just to make money. They're building it. I imagine in the case of Forgiving, like to help simplify the fundraising process for 350 or 400 nonprofits, it's got to be really easy to get out of bed in the morning, right? But I still think like on the financial side, it's just like maybe you just could think a little differently sometimes. Like I don't know, for whatever reason, I found that to be a challenge sometimes here. Like maybe it's just like the corporate mindset that kind of dominates. You just don't have the stories of the equity compensation really becoming kind of life changing, and hopefully that'll continue to change over time as we have more and more big exits and whatnot.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of what stage of life you're at. I mean, I was single when I moved out to California. I mean, if I knew better, I would have, said, less salary for more equity. But yeah, I mean, when we have a family, obviously you need to pay for food, housing, whatever. And the life circumstances change. So
do you have any advice for new founders, Joe, whether it has to do with like baking in this data-driven approach or negotiating equity or anything like that?
But as far as future founders or even if you're not into the entrepreneurial mindset is some stuff that we touched on before is just like finding the group of people that you'll maybe eventually kind of go as a group to different companies. I don't think anybody is probably going to be at the same company their whole life in the tech industry. At least you're going to probably be at multiple companies. It's not going to be like my dad, who was had his company for 40 or however many 45 years. Just kind of finding that group of people that you work well with and you trust, and there's integrity among everybody. And the other thing is, as far as entrepreneurs, I think finding ways to get yourself out there, it helps you. I think you hone the product and be able to explain the product that you're working on a lot easier, and being able to communicate with your team as well as outside individuals, whether you're going to investors for capital or whatever, just to be able to have those communication skills.
Who do you see that is really executing right now? Are there any founders or a company, maybe people haven't even heard of them, or maybe it's Google? Who knows? You would have the insight on that. But do you see anybody right now that's really executing?
Everybody I talk to, I think, yeah, that's really great. I never thought of it that way, or I never thought of a product like that. And, I want to invest in it. And I can't. I mean, I have to force myself to go through some other criteria to narrow down my list. But one that I keep on going back to my mind is a company called Pipe. And they had this product where a company they work with like larger companies who have recurring revenue, but like the recurring revenue, if it's like, I'm not going to explain this really well, but if the recurring revenue is like $10,000 a month, so that means like $120,000 a year. Well, this Pipe company will match you with an investor that will pay you this upfront $120,000 for the whole year. So then you can start investing that in different initiatives that you want, and then obviously the investor gets a little cut from that. That idea might have been around for a while, but I just thought that was an interesting way to help other companies.
Yeah, that Pipe company is so interesting because I think you're right. I think that financial model of providing almost like a loan product against future recurring revenue has sort of been around through service providers or financing companies for maybe a while, but they productized it and they brought it to scale. It actually becomes a really disruptive force for, like, say, the SaaS kind of VCs who, in the past could make these really relatively safe investments because of the predictability of the cash flow. The effect that would have in diluting the founder's equity was probably pretty tremendous for a lot of the breakout SaaS companies. And now with what Pipe's been able to do to bring scale to this type of capital sourcing has the potential to dramatically increase the founder's ability to maintain equity, and maybe early investors as well.
After you see it, it's like, yeah, that makes sense. I always am intrigued by ideas that, like, yeah, why didn't I think of that?
It's kind of the mark of a good idea, isn't it? Where it's like, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah, it's like staring right at you in your face, and you're like
a flashlight on a cell phone.
Right.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. I always enjoy our conversations, and you have such an interesting career that you're on between, the once in a generation kind of opportunity to work in the early days of a Google, and then moving on to your own startups. And it's incredible to hear, the the different turns that you've had in your career and to share some of the wisdom along the way. We appreciate you taking the time.
Right. No, I appreciate you offering this opportunity. I read the Outliers book by Malcolm Gladwell, which I'm sure a lot of people have, and I kind of see that in me, that I was, as well as everybody in this call, is we're kind of born at the right time to be able to take advantage of these opportunities, and I hope that continues for everybody.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.